There are more than 198,000 renter households who have reported through the Census Bureau's Pulse survey within the last 2 weeks that they are behind on rent. And that means there are 198,000 households in Washington state that would be subject to or vulnerable to eviction should we not have a robust and strong eviction moratorium to protect them until we have a longer term plan in place to handle the amount of debt that tenants are accruing right now. So I think in addition to that, all of you probably know that the CDC at the federal level has issued a moratorium earlier this month that applies to states that don't have a stronger eviction moratorium. And so if we were to lose our state moratorium on the 15th, the state would be covered by the CDC federal moratorium, which, you know, it's like, oh, great, we have a backup plan. But no, it's not as strong. It's much weaker than what we currently have. And to allow our state moratorium to lapse and to be reliant on the CDC moratorium would be a step backwards. There are several ways in which that moratorium is weaker compared to what we currently have, in which specifically it doesn't cover no-cause evictions, which would just, you know, that's just a loophole in the whole thing, right? It doesn't cover behavior-related evictions, and we know that landlords are often what will happen is if someone is behind on rent, a landlord will find a way to sort of start issuing 10-day notices for minor things, and then they add up, and then all of a sudden the person is evicted when really, you know, they should never have been in the first place. And then another of the reasons why the federal moratorium is not as strong is that it puts the onus on the tenant to have to assert a right of coverage, actively assert. And so that means they have to know how to actually go about doing that. They have to fill out a form, they have to access the form, which may not be in their primary language, it may not be accessible to them in other ways, and then assert that to their landlord and say, I'm covered. Whereas our state moratorium automatically covers all tenants. So I want to just back up a little bit again and start and talk a little bit about the statewide data. You're all aware from probably your personal interactions with people you work with or people in your community or people you know, or even yourself, the massive impact that this is having on people in terms of the amount of debt that's being accrued. I want to just like really focus on equity for a second, and racial equity, because the disproportionate impact is happening to communities of color in terms of people falling behind on rent and in terms of confidence in being able to pay next month's rent. So for example, the data is showing that black households are more than 6 times as likely as white households to have fallen behind on rent right now, which means they're that much more likely to be evicted than white households. We already know there's research from the Seattle Women's Commission and other more like regional and statewide research that shows that black households are more likely, several times more likely than white households to be evicted, which is a huge problem, and we need to address these things on a policy level and an institutional level. So in addition, female-headed households are being hit harder by an inability to pay rent. Older adults are households with larger numbers of people in their household, and of course, people who are lower income are disproportionately impacted by this. I also want to note that the whole debt piece of this is huge, and I'm sure we're all thinking about this, but you know, what happens when someone falls several months behind on rent can impact their life in so many ways in the future. We're even seeing that tenants who are not behind on rent are only able to stay current on rent because they're using credit cards, which have 20% interest rates, borrowing funds from friends and family, draining their savings accounts just to be able to stay current on rent, and just to be able to like stay afloat right now. But eventually those resources run out, and people are taking on more and more debt, and then eventually will accrue debt to a landlord potentially, which, as we all know, is one of the biggest sort of like marks on a person's rental history. Not to mention credit scores, not to mention, you know, the eviction record itself. So there's just so many down the road impacts that this debt is going to have on people that, you know, there's just a lot of opportunity in this upcoming state legislative session to be focused on those things. But of course, I want to come back to, in the meantime, the most immediate thing we need to do is extend the eviction moratorium at the state level to through March 31st. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to our action alert somewhere. I have it. So that you can take action like immediately. Sorry, flipping back and forth between windows is hard. So, so here's a link where you can send an email to Governor Inslee telling him to extend the eviction moratorium until March 31st. The timeline of this is really, really urgent, actually. He has convened a work group over the last several weeks, and there may be folks on this call who have been a part of that work group. But it's a work group to basically focus on the eviction moratorium. And there have been, he's separated the groups into sort of like a pro-tenant group and a pro-landlord group. And the topics have focused on a range of issues from like, you know, rent increases to, you know, the sort of question of like, what happens if someone does criminal activity in the building? What, you know, how do we handle that? The tenants have done a really, really excellent job at pushing back against a lot of harmful narratives that have come up. And so in addition to that work that's being done in the work group itself, we need to have an outside mobilization game pushing as hard as possible to ensure that both we extend the moratorium until March of 2021, which will allow the legislature to take this issue up in a more robust way rather than sort of just extending the moratorium like month by month. And will also allow us to have a strong moratorium that doesn't have any sort of loopholes or isn't weakened at all between now and then. So if there's one ask that I would have for all of you today, it would be please take action and click that link, send an email, send a message to the governor. I do want to say just a couple other things. I'm probably sort of rambling too much and running out of time, but the Housing Alliance, like I said, we work at the state level on policy issues around housing and homelessness, and we are finalizing our legislative agenda for the 2021 legislative session. Some of the top line issues that we're really going to be focused on this year, and we hope that, you know, many, if not all of you, will also be as excited about them as we are, include putting the eviction moratorium into statute, meaning not having it be something that's just extended by executive authority, but having it be like a long-term protection, which also must include just cause. So last year and the year before that, the Housing Alliance, along with a lot of other partners in this space and around the state, put forth a just cause bill that would protect tenants from no-cause evictions, which are often discriminatory and retaliatory and mask, you know, racial discrimination and other kinds of discrimination. So just cause would need to be included in that bill. Progressive revenue is a huge, like this is one of the biggest opportunities we're going to have this coming legislative session to actually enact some form of progressive revenue so that our state doesn't have the most regressive and worst tax code in the whole country. What exactly that looks like, we're not quite sure yet. We don't know if it means, you know, capital gains versus a state payroll tax versus allowing local jurisdictions to do something or what. It's a little early for that, but there are lawmakers thinking about it and working on it right now. And it's incredibly important that we as advocates and community members voice how important it is to flip our tax code this year, particularly since our state is facing a huge budget deficit, and without any sort of like new revenue, and especially new progressive revenue, we'll be looking at having to make cuts to state funded programs, which usually the first things that get funded or defunded or are cut are human services and social services programs, which we don't want to do. So progressive revenue is important. One other additional lead agenda item that the Housing Alliance has been working on and will continue to work on is a form of what Seattle has, which is called the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance, which prohibits discrimination based on a person's criminal record or a person having had a criminal history on their record when they're applying for housing. So it prevents a landlord from being able to use that against somebody to deny them tenancy. We know the very clear overlap and intersection with our racist criminal legal system and the incarceration system and the over-policing of particularly Black and brown communities. And this is another way that racist system shows up in housing, in that it prevents people from being able to get into housing in the first place. So that's unacceptable. And so at the state level, we're hoping to introduce a bill or support folks to introduce a bill on that as well. Let me look at my notes and just see if there are other things I want to mention. Again, I don't want to take up too much more time. I guess the last thing, two things I want to say. So East King County is a very strategic part of the state for tenant protections, if you don't already know this, at the state level. So there are 2 to 3, usually kind of 2 major committees that most tenant protection bills will go through. There's the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee in the House, and there's the Senate Housing Affordability and Stability Committee in the Senate, and sometimes the Financial Institutions Committee, but these are the 2 main ones. The chair of the Senate Housing Stability and Affordability Committee is Senator Cooterer in the 48th District. In the House, we have Representative Ty in the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee. We have Representative Wallen, who's also in the 48th District in the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee. Representative Goodman in the 45th District is also in that committee. And so to be able to advance any of our tenant protection bills, we have to have all of their support, like enthusiastic support, particularly this year because there's so limited capacity in the legislature to be able to pass a lot of big bills. And I would consider things like just cause and eviction protections to be big lifts from an advocacy perspective. So it's going to take kind of an all hands on deck approach this year for us to be able to build the momentum and see these things across the finish line. And East King County, like Bellevue, Redmond, like all these districts, the 41st, the 45th, the 48th in particular, and the 5th, I would say, which is like, obviously like further east in King County, are going to be incredibly pivotal, I think, in terms of getting these things passed. So I just want to throw that out there and as sort of like an encouragement to this group in particular to keep doing this work and keep organizing and keep especially contacting your lawmakers when the legislative session comes around. And then, okay, my final plug, and I'll wrap it up, is we have, the Housing Alliance does a conference every year. It's called the Conference on Ending Homelessness. And it's actually next week. It's October 7th and 8th for, Wednesday and Thursday of next week. It's all virtual. Registration is still open. Because it's all virtual, the registration fee is much lower than it normally would be because we don't have to rent a whole space and do all the whole fancy in-person stuff. So registration fees are fairly affordable, and we have scholarships if need be. So I'm going to put the conference, oh yeah, thank you, Debbie. There's the link right there. It's just wliha.org/conference. And go ahead and visit the conference, check out the schedule and everything, and hopefully you will register. But yeah, I will. I'll give it back to you, Debbie, and thank you for letting me join today.
Thank you so much, John. I want to give people, we have a couple more minutes for John here with us, and he's going to stay and be part of one of the breakout rooms, so we appreciate that. But if anyone has questions for John, one that's come up is about the Pulse survey that you mentioned. Where can we find those numbers?
Yeah, there's a webpage. I'll put the link in the chat, which it actually allows you to go back and look at each of the different weeks like the data kind of changes over time, and they upload different spreadsheets with new data. So you can look at all the questions they ask over time, and they have additional data that includes like education and healthcare and other things like that, not just housing. So it's super, super informative. Yeah, I'll plop that in the chat in a second.
Appreciate it. And we have a comment from Liz, hoping that you might be able to develop a 1 or 2 summary page of the great information that you shared, or just something that people can spend a little bit more time on. And, you know, John, I know you're super busy, but if that's something that you have available to share, we can post that on our Eastside Renters in Crisis page for people to have and look at later.
Yeah, I guess it would be good to know which of what I just mentioned would be, like, would you like in a one-pager? Something, if it's something about the eviction moratorium and sort of like the, like some of the data that I mentioned around the pulse survey, we can, I think we probably already have something, but we can send something out around that. But also if you're looking for something that's around our legislative priorities for the year, we'll have something like that soon too.
Great. Yes. All the data, all the stats. So we love the enthusiasm. Thank you, everyone. And we will be sharing lists of action items. Thank you, MJ. We have great partners here who, of course, you can subscribe to their email lists. They have the most up-to-date things that they're tracking around housing, affordable housing, and tenants' rights. And then also you'll get that from us when it comes to East King County needs and state needs. So stay tuned for that. Everybody give a nice wave and thank you to John. We appreciate it, and we'll see you back in the breakout rooms. Thank you. So at this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce Burien's Deputy Mayor, Krystal Marx. Krystal is joining us, and we're going to do a little bit of an interview format and encourage you all to also put questions in the chat. We may not be able to get to all of them. One of the groups will be lucky enough to have Deputy Mayor Marx in their group, so you can perhaps follow up with her there. But we will definitely make sure that we do our best to get as many questions as possible answered. So Krystal, welcome. If you could say hello, we'll get you on the screen here and welcome you in.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you today.
Great. Very good. So we have some questions that have come up, and really just been tracking what Burien has been doing. Thank you to you, your colleagues. Of course, your process started before COVID as far as looking at renter protections and putting some things in place. So I guess my first question to you, Krystal, is thinking back to that process, if you could just share some of the key steps that led up to the renter protection policies that you all passed last October. And I know that's a big question. There was a lot involved, but we'd love to hear some of the highlights maybe and lessons learned of that process.
Sure, I would be happy to. This process happened almost entirely because community organizations all came together and formed their own sort of coalition and had meetings on their own without necessarily requiring or waiting for city council to have those meetings for them. So those coalitions consisted of educators from the Highline School District. Burien is entirely within Highline. Educators, parents, the faith community was huge. They were already doing a lot of education on their own around social justice and tenant protections and what it meant to really keep kids and families safe and housed. That was really spurred by a year before that. I believe it was in 2018, the very beginning of 2018, we experienced a really big crisis in Burien. The Fox Cove apartments were, some people might remember from a couple years ago on the news, those apartments were sold and all of a sudden 36 units were evicted just overnight. It was, some had adequate notice, some we believe did not, but it was the last true bit of really affordable lower income housing. So we're talking like 30% of area median income or AMI. These were veterans, these were disabled individuals, students that were going to school literally across the street. Everyone just mass evictions. So it was a scramble to figure out how to protect them. And that really spurred the community on to look at how to prevent this in the future. And it started with just cause eviction reform, and then it moved into other things as well. What about a housing ombudsman? What about distribution of information, notice to other low-income housing providers that units of 5 or more are going to be sold? So we started compiling all of this information, and we had 4 different listening sessions over the course of early 2019. February was 1, 2 in March, and 1 in June. They were mostly geared around community as a whole. There was one dedicated specifically just to landlords, in case there was that feeling of, I don't feel safe coming forward and expressing any concerns. But to a meeting, to every single meeting, people that were showing up and saying what was their priority, it was to keep people safe and to keep people housed, and to also be made whole at the end of it. So the landlords that did express concerns, it wasn't, I want to push people out because I want to sell my property. It was, I just want to make sure that I'm, still able to conduct this business of mine in a ethical manner. That was what we heard individually, from small mom and pop landlords up to some of the larger ones that decided to show. And because City Council got to sit in on those meetings and just take notes and listen and answer questions, not really guide the discussion, it was just a listening session, we were able to get some really honest, authentic feedback, and staff condensed that into the 6 or so policies or 7 policies that we passed then, starting September of 2019 through October 7th.
Wow, thank you for that, Krystal. It sounds like there was quite a bit of outreach. Do you feel, or how successful, I guess, would you say that outreach was in reaching out to folks that tend to be disenfranchised from civic participation, Black, Indigenous, other people of color, immigrants, people who are English language learners? We're just curious about that. We're all struggling with that, of course. It's at the top of mind for so many of us. What kind of strides have you made, or what work are you building on in Burien around that outreach?
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite questions to answer, because it needs to be front and center on all the work that we're doing as a city. No one city speaks one language. No one city is made up of one person. We all bring different aspects of ourselves to the table whenever we show up. So what worked really well for us was, besides having all of our outreach materials in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, which are the primary languages spoken in Burien in terms of percentage wise, it was also employing trusted messengers. So in this case, making sure we're paying people for their efforts to go out into the community. And we had one individual is going to the Ukrainian community, and they're a member of that community. We're paying them for their time and effort. We're saying, hey, can you make sure to do outreach and let them know this is happening, bring back any concerns. So that was a good step in the right direction. I don't think we did nearly enough. It was our first time really as a city. So Burien at the time was only 25 years old. We're now all of 28 years old. We're just growing or 26 years old. We're growing so quickly. We had not been in the practice of doing outreach to the community, period. And that's something that we've learned from, I hope, and we are continuing to improve upon. But it's going to where people are. It's not expecting them to come to you. It's not expecting that everyone looks at your website and knows how to navigate it. So in that same time, we were doing a website redesign as well to make it more intuitive, but it's going into churches, it's going into schools, it's going into marketplaces, and where people are gathering, and making sure information is in the applicable languages that people are speaking, and there's a good explanation of what will or will not be happening. Burien is a welcoming city. So we passed an ordinance a few years ago, Ordinance 651, that says that we're a welcoming city, that you're not going to be questioned about your citizenship. You're not going to be, services won't be withheld for any reason. We have no right to question you about anything. But that doesn't mean that it's just a natural blanket, everything's okay. It's then also us reinforcing that. And every time we do outreach, we're asking you to come in for a reason. We want to make sure that you are here and engaged. We have food provided so that if you're giving up your time, you're going to at least have something in your belly. There was childcare provided as well, which we knew was really important. So that looked like some city staff, and we hired additional nannies as well from a local organization. And the kids made fantastic "What Does Home Mean to You" artwork that they then brought back to us, which really sealed the deal at the end of a really stressful conversation. So it's making sure that we're just addressing all those different intersections of what might prevent someone from showing up. And usually that is members of our BIPOC, our Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color communities, where we haven't done that work before.
I really appreciate what you're saying there, and about the how new that effort is, how new it is for you all as Burien leaders to be thinking about that. And I think that's true for many of our East King County cities too, and throughout the state and nation. And I really especially like that you name trusted messengers. We are finding that too, that whether it was for the census or getting information out about COVID, really relying on so many of our community advocates, and many of whom are on the call here today, to, they have those trusted relationships and partnerships with community members, and they are seen as the go-to for all kinds of questions that people have. So being able to utilize that is really, really important. We're curious about, as your council was beginning to move forward towards putting those policies in place, what were some of the challenges and how did you address them? You did talk about speaking, having a group specifically that was for landlords, speaking one-on-one with a range of people. But if you could go into a little bit more around some of the hiccups and perhaps bigger barriers that showed up, we'd appreciate knowing a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. There were hiccups. There weren't as many as I was expecting them to be. Really, the biggest thing was making sure that people understood what we were talking about. So not using a lot of the, everyone's probably going to laugh, but you think about a typical politician or a city council meeting or a government meeting, and there's acronyms flying all over the place. There's committee names, there's budgetary processes, and it was stopping and realizing, like, we might say just cause eviction, but what does that actually mean? Does that mean that someone is, oh, sorry, here's my, my 5-year-old is popping in. Hi, Meg. All right, I'm talking really quick, sorry.
Got some gems.
Yes, you do, thank you. Kindergarten at home, folks. It means making sure that people understand that just cause eviction doesn't mean that someone has broken the law. Like just and justice was getting confused. It was really breaking down before the start of every one of those meetings, the 4 meetings that we held, what these policies were. I am a huge advocate of using social media for a tool in government. So for me, on my deputy mayor page at the time, or council member page at the time, breaking down each policy idea that we had. What are your questions? Sharing it around in different Burien community groups, so that by the time people came to these meetings and gave us their feedback, it was less spooling up about what these terms meant and more, okay, I have a rough idea. Now I can have a good conversation and I don't feel left out of the conversation. If it would be helpful, I can tell you what the 7 policies really are that we passed. Okay.
Yes,
so
please.
Awesome. Really quick, I won't go into detail. There are pages and pages of this on our website, but the first one was in September of 2019, and that was passing a rental housing inspection program. We modeled ours after a combination of kind of Kent meets Renton meets Seattle. That's kind of the Burien way, is to not reinvent the wheel. That involved hiring a rental housing inspection coordinator, paid for entirely out of the rental housing inspection program's fees. So different fees for different size landlords or properties. So small mom and pop is very different than your multi, hundreds of units. That was in September. That was an easy one for council to pass because other cities had not only have already done it, but the landlords themselves were already paying a business license fee, and it made sense for them to say, okay, yes, it would be good for me to know what is good living conditions. How do I need to upkeep my building so I'm not out of compliance? When Burien formed in 1993, we inherited a lot of King County buildings, or a lot of buildings that were already out of compliance in the 90s. So for us, it was about making sure we got everyone up to code and kept families healthy. Then on October 7th, we passed that suite of tenant protections. That was Ordinance number 716. If anyone wanted to look it up on our website, I'll also try to find the link. The first one of those was the distribution of information. So a landlord is now required in Burien to give information on tenant law in Washington State, dispute resolution, both at the city with the tenants union, county level. All the information has to be provided in an appropriate language to that tenant. So before they sign their rental agreement, they have to prove that they have that ready for them. We also have deposit regulations as well. So installments are now required on deposits when you move in. You can request to have them spread out over 3 or more months, and it cannot be more than 25% of your first month's deposit or your first month's rent. So it can't. So what we're doing is, oh, I see the link is already in the chat. Thanks, Chris. What we're doing is making sure that as people are moving, whether they're moving into Burien from out of town or they're moving from place to place, whether they had a just eviction, whatever that looks like, they're able to actually move into a place and not have those first, last, and deposits pile up on them. It's something our family has faced personally, where we live in a house where we are renters and have been all of our lives, but our rent is $2,000 a month. That would be $6,000 to move in for a family of 6. And I work full time. So just kind of keeping that in mind, that was really important for us. We also, I mentioned earlier, the notice of sale for low-income housing for units of 5 units or more. So if there's an apartment complex that has 5 or more units, where there's some provide low-income housing already, they have to provide that notice of sale to low-income housing providers and property owners 60 days before they list the sale to the public. That allows 2 months of time for these other providers to be able to consider buying it and keeping it affordable for our families so people aren't displaced. Again, that came directly from Fox Cove. The people that bought it were out-of-town developers and then sold it to, I think, a Bellevue company, and they did improvements, but people had to leave. So that was important to us. Again, I mentioned just cause eviction. We bundled that after Seattle. We have had a legal challenge to that, which I believe we prevailed on, if it's not still ongoing, but it's nothing different than what has been proposed to the state and what passed in Seattle as well, that we are requiring that you provide cause that fits within a set of requirements. We have a housing ombudsman, who is a position that we also appointed. Right now, I believe it's currently co-occupied by our rental housing inspection coordinator and our city manager. So that ombuds person is directly responsible, or in this case people, for settling disputes between tenants and landlords, for providing information on rental housing policies, for talking or answering questions on, yes, that's legal, no, that's illegal, where did you hear that, and really being that go-between and neutral third party to keep things moving and to facilitate a conversation, to help find interpreters. If someone is saying, you know what, I think I understand what this means, but it's not my language, how do I do this? And landlords are using this service too. How do I translate this lease agreement? How do I do X, Y, and Z? And they're coming to us and saying that we want to be in compliance. How do I do that? And this ombuds person is the one that does it. And then finally, compliance and enforcement is really important too. So there are actual civil fines and penalties assigned to non-compliance. That can be for just cause eviction and failing to do that properly. That's $2,000 plus all of the tenant's fees. There's a lot of fees worked into this. So we have a lot of carrots, but we also wanted to make sure there was a stick in place as well. So that's a lot at one time. And again, definitely happy to answer additional questions about those policies.
Yeah, and please, again, to everybody, want to encourage you to put some questions in the chat if you have. I think some of the things that you were just bringing up there, Deputy Mayor, was leading me to the next question, which was about capacity and staff resources, budget for not just the extensive outreach engagement that went into this, but also the enforcement process. You talked a little bit about the Ombudsman, and just curious about if we're, for our fellow council members from other cities here who are curious about the dollars associated with this kind of an effort, what would you say to that, or what kind of, what are you looking at financially for that ongoing?
Yeah, I've got two answers. The answer from my heart is that there is no cost too high in my mind to have a housing ombudsperson on staff, whether employed by the city or outside resource. That's a golden position where there's true neutrality, and it's all about finding common ground and working together and answering questions before it goes into litigation, before someone is evicted. There could be a quick question that would save a family from being evicted, when it's really just a matter of, nope, you didn't understand that part of whatever it was, really quickly. So the rental housing inspection program I mentioned, that pays for the housing coordinator. So the fees from that pay that individual's salary, which is wonderful. We also just voted to increase the business license fees this year because of COVID, and they haven't been adjusted in a few years. So those fees went up a little bit for those who are property owners who rent in the city of Burien. Fee-wise, we spent under, I think it was well under 200,000 total to do all the surveys, outreach in 2019. I think in COVID times, we're used to hearing that, it's going to be more of a challenge, but I think honestly, it would be a little bit easier now to do something like this and to do this outreach when more people are now used to having 6 or 7 months of Zoom meetings, and having smaller one-on-one sessions or doing listening sessions through surveys. Farmers markets, having things set up there. We did that as well. We also had people fill out surveys at our Thursday evening farmers markets. So it's less about the funds that go into it and more about where this is as a priority, and knowing that it helps long-term. We knew it also would help our long-term human services budget by not having to spend as much on helping to rehouse people. The cost to rehouse a family, like those 36 units I mentioned for Fox Cove, was astronomical. The amount of money required to move people in and pay that first, last, and deposit for a family that was evicted. And then having to, I think John from the Low Income Housing Association also mentioned it, the marks on your credit after being evicted, no one cares that you were evicted because a building was sold. They just see eviction. And it's keeping that in mind, is we're saving money in the long run as a city by paying for a position up front that can help navigate people through a process of disputes and evictions, as opposed to paying for it on the back end when the people are already in that situation.
That's very good. I love what you're talking about the cost savings overall, and how investing in what you have invested in, you're really seeing you're looking at the whole picture of community health and well-being, and really seeing this as a key way to help support and mitigate expenses in other areas that often are exacerbated because of housing crisis and housing insecurity. We had a question from Carla, which is, how do or can elected officials make sure that they are being held accountable to the community? So how do you hold yourself accountable in Burien?
I think that's a great question. And I wish, no, I don't wish we were asked that more, but I wish that it was asked in larger spaces like this every time that we speak. In this case, as it pertains to tenant protections and rental housing and affordability, I personally, I like to engage in monthly coffee chats and talk with people, but it's more than that. It's more about asking the community, are you seeing things work well? And if you're not, then that means that either something in the system is broken, which is almost always the case, that if something isn't working well, or how can we help you? What program is missing at the city that needs more funding, or is there more education that can be provided? It's doing that proactive outreach and asking instead of waiting for our once a year annual crime survey and maybe having a question about housing thrown in there as an aside. It's being proactive about sharing when we're meeting, accessibility, making sure it's not just you can request a Spanish interpreter, but you have to do it 48 hours before the meeting, but the agenda is posted 50 hours before the meeting, so you've got a 2-hour window. That's not equitable for anybody. It's making sure that we say, okay, we're going to pay for Spanish and Vietnamese interpretation at every meeting, and if people show up and need it, fantastic. And if they don't, at least it's here. It's making sure we're being proactive in our thinking. And every other way, I think, you have every 4 years to vote. And if you don't like how someone is doing their job, I encourage you to vote them out. And that goes for me as well. I am up next year, so I'm really keeping that in mind. And maybe I shouldn't have said that. So be kind with your vote, but vote people, engage in that process, attend meetings, speak up, and continually writing in and engaging in that whole public process is really, really important. We do see the emails that come in, and if we're seeing something over and over again saying there's a problem and you're not addressing it, then that is its own issue, and that needs to be discussed as well.
I'm thinking about how curious really about, the fact that Burien went through this process and put these things in place 4 or 5 months before COVID hit. How do you feel that has positioned you as a city, as a community, given that you had a head start on things that other cities are just now kind of trying to explore?
It definitely lessened our feeling of panic in some ways. We've said it numerous times. We're really glad we have this program in place, or, Just Cause is in place, or whatever it is. We spoke up very early on in the COVID crisis. I think it was maybe early in March, and one of our first March meetings when things were starting to get a little weird. State of emergency was already in place, and thinking, what can we do to protect people who are the most at risk of losing their homes? And Burien was ready with a eviction moratorium at the city level almost immediately. And then Governor Inslee passed his, and so we went with his to avoid a legal challenge. So by having that ready and being forward thinking, because we already had these policies in place to protect people currently in their homes, it allowed us to be able to free up our resources, both financial and just mental resources and staff, to look to the future of what else can we do. We set aside $200,000 at the start of the COVID pandemic for us, specifically towards human services, to help get people who were experiencing food insecurity or didn't have access to technology, couldn't get masks, whatever it was at the time. I believe it was in April or so. That's $200,000 we were able to put towards this, as opposed to relocation assistance, because we already have this ombuds person in place, so they're able to work through those issues. So this was really like laying the foundation for us as a city on how to take care of our residents, that allowed us to then build on it, and to build up and to build out, and to make sure that we knew we had the sound foundation. Now we can build those good, strong bones moving forward. Without it, I don't know we would have been able to do that $200,000 to help out in our communities. We certainly couldn't have done anything with technology or food insecurity. There would be no way we'd be totally focused on using as much CARES Act funding as we could on just tenant protections.
That's great. We do have a question about the potential legal challenge that Burien was concerned about. And I'm wondering, Deputy Mayor, if you could answer that question, and then maybe say a couple words about what you see on the horizon for Burien's next steps. You spoke a little bit there, but just want to give you an opportunity to share that.
Yeah, so when I mentioned the potential legal challenge, there is a landlord association that lobbies very hard at the state level, that also tried to lobby against this a little bit, came to a few of our meetings, specifically the landlord specific one, as well as our final June of 2019 listening session, and tried to present some there's not a polite way to say it, tried to provide some different facts about what policies like just cause eviction would mean and how it would be this horrible thing. But in those meetings, even the landlords that were present were shouting them down and saying, no, actually, here's my lived experience. Here's why I'm renting out. And people were more engaged. And the legal challenge on that was really just saying, you know, the landlord organization didn't believe that we have the right as a city or the legal ability to prevent evictions. It's that contract between the landlord and the tenant. But luckily for Burien, again, we went with the governor's eviction moratorium at that higher level. There are times when preemption is horrible for a city, and there are times when it's great. And this was the one time where it was wonderful to be able to sign on with the governor. And then we've also been very vocal as well about please extend every time when it came up a couple months or a couple weeks into it, please extend. We're saying it again, please extend through March of 2021 as well. Keep people in their homes and using our power as a city to support that. That's the extent of the legal challenge that we know of. There's been no other further anything filed. What's on the horizon for Burien, though, you also asked, as it pertains to tenant protections. We have 3 new city council members that came on this last year, and obviously we have elections again next year. So we're still figuring out a bit, not only just how to work with each other, but also what should the priorities be, and not being hasty to make them our priorities, but keep that community focus going. And right now there's so many people in our community are focused on how do I get my kids through Zoom. I was mentioning at the start of this, I've got 4 kids at 4 different schools. My brain hurts. Thankful for my partner in that. But how do we get our families through the day? How do we provide for our families and get food on the table? How do we stay in these homes? What if my landlord decides to try to evict even when there's an eviction moratorium in place? And we know through the Attorney General's office, through Bob Ferguson's office, that people have tried. They've tried during this time to still evict during an eviction moratorium, and they've done it across the country. So for us, we're so focused on community-led responses, but the community is focused on responding to COVID, and then also public safety has been the other huge item on our agenda in Burien, and taking community direction on that as well. So as we move forward, my hope and what I'm committed to is hearing that we'll hear from more community, that this proactive outreach will continue to go on. And if that means that we're doing it individually as council members, and hey, faith community, come to the table. Hey, educators, come to the table. Hey, youth council, come to the table, and giving them that access directly to council, then that's what we'll do. But until then, COVID has been a wrench in so many plans. So just wanting to make sure that whatever we do is really driven by community, not by our own personal thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take some time in the coming days to reflect back on what you've said and shared. I was taking notes madly, and we do have the recording for folks who want to check back on it later. I just thank you for your leadership and for the extraordinary care that you all are showing to really prioritize the needs of some of our families, the families in Burien there who are really struggling and completely in crisis and panic mode right now. And I look forward to seeing what this means for Burien, that you've taken these steps and how longer term this supports the infrastructure that you want in the community. And it'll be great to see that. Thank you again. Please, if you all could, yes, thank you for sharing your gratitude. So welcome back again to everyone. Thank you for participating in the small groups. It is our intent and desire to have many more community members on these calls, and it is a big challenge. Tech-wise, it's a challenge. Bandwidth, energy, what people have on their plate that they're dealing with these days, as you know, it's enormous. We know that the financial stress and worry about housing, so many folks are bearing the brunt of systemic barriers and problems that have been longstanding challenges in our region. So we're trying to find culturally sensitive and supportive ways to bring voices forward. And I really want to thank our community partners who are on the call today, and some who couldn't join us, but who are in the spaces of really supporting community members and helping them to bring their needs forward, to make sure that they are heard, whether that is being able to participate like this or to share their voice in other ways. And I just quickly wanted to share with you a story that Lalita from the India Association of Western Washington gave to me today. And I so appreciate that, Lalita. Thank you. She said that they're helping a couple in their mid-30s. The wife got diagnosed with kidney disease a couple of years ago, and she was on the wait list for a kidney transplant. Her husband was a tech worker. He suffered a stroke in the middle of all this going on. Both of them lost their jobs and couldn't afford their rent. She fortunately has just got the transplant surgery, but now she's needing that care at home and the rest. And IAWW's crisis services were able to help them get a one-room rental in a family home. And they're providing, the IAWW is providing their rent and food for the next several months. They're on a wait list for low-income housing, but we know that those take a very long time. And this is a family that cannot be homeless. They're medically vulnerable, and they're not able to work. So this isn't something that was necessarily COVID related, right? This is just a time where we're seeing an exacerbation of longstanding problems in our community. I do want to share that there are several events coming up, and I hope that you can continue to connect there. I want to let you know that if you are, what our next steps will be as far as advocacy is, we're continuing to follow up and be in dialogue with our local city councils, our legislators. If you have a desire to be part of those efforts, to even hear about them and get follow-ups on what's happening, I encourage you to contact me through that link I just posted there. Those of you on the phone can go to eastsideforall.org and contact me there, and I'll follow up with you. So very quickly wanted to share a couple things coming up with you all. These are some events happening, one happening tomorrow. Thank you to ELAP, the Tenant Law Center, and the Tenants Union. I'm going to post these links in the chat too, so you all can copy that before we close today. The 5th Legislative District Candidate Forum. Thank you to many of the members on our call today who are jointly hosting that along with Eastside for All, and that's on Monday evening. We encourage you to participate there. Conference on Ending Homelessness that John mentioned is coming up through the 7th through the 8th. And Affordable Housing Week. One of the events is Eastside specific. We really encourage you to sign up for that. That's on the 14th. And lastly, where is my little slide here for, again, our effort here, Eastside Renters in Crisis. You can find it at the Eastside for All website. And Eastside for All posts issues related to our housing and rental and tenant events on Facebook, and hope you will also follow our various partners because they're doing really great work there. Let me post this information for you. I hope I didn't. Yeah, that's my contact information again. I want to thank you all for being on the call. And if you hold on for 1 second, I'll grab this these links that I just shared for those events, because that we really want to make sure you get connected up with some things happening in the community. There we go. All right. Thank you all for sharing. Thank you for posting your questions. We do take all of your chat information forward. It helps us as we're creating events and as we're advocating on behalf of the community with our local leaders. So please stay tuned, and we will follow up to make sure that you have the recording for today and that you get invitations to our next steps and next events. And thank you again to Deputy Mayor Marx from Burien, and also John Stovall, who helped provide our information and updates today. We're so appreciative of your work. Thank you all for all that you're doing. Stay as healthy as you possibly can and stay connected, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you again.